Over nearly 5 decades, hedge fund billionaire and investing legend Ray Dalio has built an iconic set of principles for how to thrive in the market and in life. He made his first stock pick at age 12 and at 26 launched Bridgewater Associates. Now it's the world's biggest hedge fund with about $223 billion in assets under management. His new book is called Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order: Why Nations Succeed and Fail. On this episode of Influencers, Dalio joins me to talk about what's behind all this inflation, how the US-China standoff will unfold, and what it all means for the global economy and your portfolio. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Influencers. I'm Andy Serwer, and welcome to our guest, Ray Dalio, founder of Bridgewater Associates and author of a new book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order: Why Nations Succeed and Fail. Ray, nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
So you've identified 3 trends in your book that lead to the decline of powerful countries, maybe like the United States, financial markets that lead to a lot of debt, internal conflict like political polarization, and pressures from the outside like rival countries. Let's start with the first one, financial markets. You've expressed concern about low interest rates that often lead to higher debt burdens and inflation. Would you say that characterizes what's happening in the United States right now?
Well, let me clarify. The 3 things that you mentioned are financial conditions, the production of debt and money to monetize those, the internal conflict over wealth and other things, politics, the greater extremism, and then the rise of a great power to challenge an existing great power in the form of China. Those 3 things never happened in my lifetime before, but they happened throughout history. And when I learned that to be surprised, I knew that I needed to study prior periods. The reason we anticipated the 2008 financial crisis was because we studied the Great Depression. And so to answer your first question about the first of those, I view it just very much mechanically. Buying power, which comes in the form of money and credit, when that's produced in a quantity which is much greater than the incremental production of goods, services, and financial assets, drives those financial asset prices to go up. And the printing of money, the monetization of debt, is a last phase in a long-term debt cycle because it indicates that when there's a lot of debt and there's a 0 interest rate and you print that money, that debt monetization has its effects. So what we're seeing now in the market is very, very, very classic. It's happened repeatedly in that enormous amount of buying power created by the creation of money, which doesn't raise living standards, that is passing through the system. And so you're seeing it happen in the inflation of goods, services, and financial assets.
Right. So many credit a similar strategy with softening the COVID-19 downturn and helping speed up the recovery. Has the Federal Reserve been too dovish, and should they raise rates more quickly than they're indicating they will?
There's a trade-off that I think everybody has to understand, and that's related to the second. With the large wealth gaps and large not enough money in lots of places, the Federal Reserve and the Treasury were put into a position of needing to get checks out. And there's also this left-right conflict issue having to do with the wealth gap. And that means that you have fiscal policies that are now requiring lots of spending. And so the question is really, are the consequences of not doing that better or worse than the consequences of doing that? Now, when we look from an investor's point of view or an individual's point of view, we have to remember that you can't raise living standards by just creating money and credit. particularly if you don't raise productivity more than that. And that means that those asset prices are going up. So we're in the phase of the cycle, very classic, that the financial asset prices have gone up because you've given them more money, that demand is going up, and now we're having inflation of those assets. So if a lot of that buying power is going to be pulled back, particularly as we go into the next year. But there's still going to be a lot, and there's still going to be a high level of inflation of those types of assets. So the trade-off is always the question.
Right. Okay, so quickly, where do you come out on that trade-off? Is it a binary yes or no?
It's a reflection of the state of where we are in the cycle, that we have borrowed. It's all the problems that we've gotten ourselves into by acquiring too much debt and spending more than we're earning rather than being more productive, and also not distributing the opportunities and the incomes in a way that it's a broad-based prosperity. So on the one hand, you have a prosperity that the bottom 60% of the population isn't participating in very much. And at the same time, you have, so it's creating that polarity. And at the same time, you have the financial markets. So those are trade-offs that, different people, the only thing I care about is whether we're productive, whether we increase the size of the pie through productivity and then divide it well so that you create something closer to equal opportunity that produces greater political stability and also draws on the population going wide. And the reason I say that is because I've studied these empires, these dynasties, going back since the last 500 years. And you see the same thing happening over and over again. When there's a financial problem, when the granaries are empty and the coffers are empty, they print money. And when they print money and the coffers are empty, it devalues money. And with that, when you have a large gap of people at each other's throats, then you create a risk of an internal conflict, a risk of some kind of civil war. And that is what I think is we're at risk of.
Yeah, I want to get to that polarization in one sec, but just quickly on inflation, Ray, how concerned are you about it?
I'm significantly concerned about it because the amount of money and credit that has to be produced right. and is budgeted is a large increase. And yet, if it's not spent, it produces its own problems. The markets have a sensitivity to that. So what it means, and then there's a supply-demand picture for bonds. And the way it looks is if you should get the selling of bonds, it worsens that supply-demand picture, because the way it works is the Treasury borrows and runs a deficit, but it can't produce money. So it has to sell bonds. And when it sells bonds, if there are not enough buyers of those bonds, then the Federal Reserve got to come in and print money and buy those bonds. And the world right now is invested in US dollar denominated bonds, pension funds on the 60-40 mix, and they have negative real returns. And cash has a lot of negative real returns. So if there was a selling of that and a moving to other assets, stocks, other assets, commodities, other assets, or other places, other currencies, other real estate and the like, that selling worsens the supply-demand picture. And then if there's not enough demand, that means that the central bank has got to come in and print more money. So yes, it's not only the inflation that's in the pipeline or projected in that supply-demand balance, but it's also what it could be if there's a selling of debt instruments.
So we're printing too much money?
It's going to produce inflation, if that's what you're saying.
Right. Okay. Let's go to the second trend you identify in declining empires, internal unrest. You write that wealth inequality often leads to the rise of populism. and division. How bad have the divisions gotten in the US, and what's most to blame for that?
Well, I think people around us, we all see it. January 6th was just a simple, but history has shown when the causes that people are behind are more important to them than the system is in jeopardy. And what we're seeing is not a classic wealth gap caused by, accompanied by political gaps. So you're seeing that the left is more left and the right is more right. And you're seeing the conflicts within the parties. In the primary elections, you're going to see in each party a competition between the moderates and the more extremes. So you're seeing that dynamic play out. You're seeing questioning of election results and questioning of rules. So you're getting to the point. Something like 15% of, I forgot whether it was Democrats or Republicans, wish the other member of the party would die, and 10% of the other party wish they would die. They don't want their children to marry other members of the party. So there's a question of even how rules will be followed. And so there's going to be a conflict. And I think it's not an exaggeration to say that you could see in the 2024 elections that no side will lose, and accept loss. And you're seeing the movement to different states related to different values. These types of things have never happened before, but in my book and my study that I did to understand them over time, they happen repeatedly through history. So I'm not just looking at what's happening today, but I'm finding that that pattern follows a very classic pattern that's repeated throughout history, which is the tendency of the middle to disappear, and that you have to pick a side and you have to fight for that side. And that's the dynamic that is what I think is going on and following the classic dynamic that's shown in the book to have happened repeatedly.
In the book, you cite the emergence of figures like Elizabeth Warren on the left and Donald Trump on the right. But Ray, do you think there's a risk here of drawing a false equivalency by framing it that way? Because Trump made concerted efforts to overturn the 2020 elections, whereas Elizabeth Warren wants higher taxes and more regulation.
I don't understand why that's a question. I'm very much a mechanic. I'm not a ideologue, not ideologically. I just take measurements. What I'm saying is that if you look at the voting records of Republicans, it's the most conservative that it has been. If you look at the voting records and policies of Democrats, it's the most left that it has been. And that if you look at, this is since 1900, if you look at the voting across party lines, it is the lowest that it has ever been. So that you have, those are just simply facts. You have a party in which basically 30% of the population is in support of let's call it the more right, let's say the Donald Trump more right, and something like 30% of the population is concerned with the more at the more left, and that within each party, that there is then a conflict between those two things, and that because of that constitutes perhaps the majority of those party members, then those that are in the middle, although they would constitute a higher percentage of the population, still let's say that swing 40 or 50% of the population, they within their parties are not dominant, and as a result, we're seeing that move to the more extremes of the two and the greater conflict.
Fair enough. I guess I was just, making the point that there's left wing, right wing, extreme left, extreme right, and then there's just not believing in facts. But I get it. You write that the U.S. has a 30.
That also is through the history. It's very interesting. You read these things. The combination in history of politics and the media operating with the emotions has been a classic dynamic that's repeated over time, the dynamic that we're seeing now, so that the media tends to become more polarized and more appealing to those who want to fight with each other. And then distortions in the media, because fighting and winning is more important than seeing both sides. And that's why the distortions that take place, and that greater polarization in the media is very, very classic. You see, and then you lose that medium.
Right. I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but explaining that the big lie is just that, maybe isn't polarization. Maybe it's just trying to get people to see facts. But
well, I think that by any measures, a sense of we're getting facts through the political system and the media, the public's readings on that are the lowest on record. So I don't think it's the getting of facts. I think there's a great concern about the inability to get the facts. And that, I'm saying, you see that in all the histories of, it's recounted in the book many times, that you see that dynamic working because everybody becomes polarized. But yeah, no, I don't think we would cheer on the efforts to get the real facts.
Good. You write that the U.S. has a 30% chance of devolving into a civil war within the next 10 years. What would cause that to happen, and who would be responsible for that?
Well, let me clarify what I mean. What I mean is that fighting over the rules, it doesn't mean necessarily shooting each other, although you could see much more violence. It means that the rules of the system, that democracy by rule of law, and the deferring to what the rules are, for example, to settle elections or settle issues, I think that that could be largely lost. I think, for example, like they had sanctuary cities, you could see situations in which the federal government would give mandates that would not be followed by the state governments. And then there's a question of how you just have power and who has what power. And I think that you're going to see a lot more tested through the legal system, and then maybe even beyond, that they won't accept those rules. And then that's a threat to our democracy, because the great thing of our democracy is that they're following the rules, believing in it. I mean, we've seen repeatedly where a presidential candidate might have the majority, but they said there's electoral votes, and it comes down to that. And then they would say, well, for the greater good, we will agree on how that works. That's a remarkable following of the rules that our system's dependent on. And I think that almost anybody looking at the situation would say that there is some significant probability that might not work as well.
You talk about wealth inequality as an attribute of declining empires, but you contrast the US with a rising China, which also has a very large disparity between rich and poor. Why is wealth inequality concerning in the case of the US, but less so when it comes to China?
Well, it has nothing to do with China or the US. It has to do with the nature of the phenomenon that you see across countries. It's not, if you have a large wealth gap or opportunity gap, and you have rising living standards, you don't have the same kind of conflict risks. It's the three, when the three work together. When you have a financial problem, and so you can't resolve that easily, and then you have the conflicts, and they can be over wealth. That's the left-right conflict. But there are other conflicts that end up, it could be, we see it about groups, that people tend to gather in groups. It could be ethnic, it could be whatever. And so you see that when you have that and you have challenges, other challenges like the rising power challenging another, there's more tension. And if you start to have lower living standards from that and a sense of inequity, it produces more conflict. That's happened repeatedly. That mix has happened repeatedly.
Let's go to the third trend that you write about in your book, which is the external threats, which in the case of the United States, you see mostly as a rising China. You say China is on its way to overtake the US as the world's most powerful country. I guess the question is, why, and is that inevitable?
Well, the population of China is 4 times that of the United States. So if it has an average income of half the United States, it will be twice as large as the United States. When I first started to go to China in 1984, since then, its income real income has increased by 26 times. So if you just extrapolate lines and you look at productivity and the like, it's a very likelihood that China will be. It's today a comparable power in many ways, and that it would become a greater power. That's just how things are transpiring. And if you look at history, China has a history of being, prior to 1800, always, like number 1 or 2, because it has a large population and it's been very productive historically.
Bridgewater invests in China, as do many other funds and companies that do business with that country. But you and others have drawn criticism for, I guess, profiting off the rise of a country challenging the United States, and at the same time acknowledging human rights violations committed by China. How do you respond to that, Ray?
Well, every company, every investor has to balance the interests of various parties. So, for example, I have a responsibility to the investors. And then if there's not connections in its ways, companies, if they were separated, all these companies dealing together, if there was a separation, that means that it would not be efficient for the whole system. And so what we're looking at is guidance really by governments who understand all the issues, geopolitical issues and the like, to try to balance those issues, the constituencies and so on. So that's really our expertise is in investing and is in economics. And we think that as we will assess what percentage of the portfolio should be there. And we do that in 40 countries. When we think we invest in Brazil and many, many countries. And we have to rely really on the guidance of not only our country, but the countries that are there, because it's not just a matter of what we individually think. It's a matter of making the right decisions based on the people who are in the responsibility of assessing them, make those decisions.
Things have changed so much over just say the past 5 years. I mean, it used to be yourself, people like you and John Mack, Hank Paulson could be described as friendly to China. And now, that description gets more difficult. You've got Mitt Romney calling you out, Fox hosts calling you a collaborator. Does it trouble you that this has changed so much, our relationship, and how people view the relationship and how you are a part of that relationship, Ray?
I could deal with me. What does trouble me is that both sides really don't know each other well. And it strikes me as a very inclination to be emotional and to fight. And that raises the odds of a fight on both sides. And it's almost a needless fight. I mean, there are things that you have to say, what will you fight for? And what are the consequences of that fight? So I believe in peace. I mean, that doesn't mean you shan't, when your essential values yourself are threatened by an outsider, I think you have to fight for that. But the inclination to immediately stereotype and fight rather than to try to seek what are the other side's perspectives, and that demonization is a dangerous thing that could bring about a war, and a needless war.
How should we, though, Ray, respond, we being the United States, respond to the rise of China, either positively, negatively, carrots, sticks? What should we do?
I think that there are 5 types of wars. The first 4 are competitions, really. There's a trade war, a technology war, a geopolitical influence war, and a capital war. Those can be viewed as competitions. And then there's a military war. In all of those cases, the most important thing that you can do is be strong. Us, internally. If we do the right things to be strong so that we are stronger than any opposition in the world, we won't have a problem. So I think the biggest war that we're having is a war with ourselves, to be able to be productive, to earn more money than we spend, to improve our income statement and our balance sheet, and to be good with each other so that we're productive together rather than at each other's throats and threatening our effectiveness.
You say a military confrontation between the US and China is unlikely for now, but becomes increasingly possible as China catches up. What are some signs that we should see perhaps that would concern us?
Well, I think if there's going to be a military war issue, it is likely to be around Taiwan. I think other issues are not military triggering. And just the view of that is Chinese perspective and American perspective both, and the world has said there's one Taiwan's part of China and they should have peaceful unification. That issue is a diplomatically worded issue, but it's an important issue that might be, could be fought over. I think that you watch it. You watch the news, you keep on top of that, and you see the actions. So beyond that, I think it's mostly the competitions in those other areas. And again, I think it's just be strong, but watch what's going on closely with Taiwan. That you'll see the straws in the wind.
Taking a step back, Ray, and looking at the big picture here, you know, it sort of suggests, at least my take on the book is that, wow, you're writing about, and you're saying empires in decline, you're writing about the US in decline. Is that the case? And is it inevitable? How bad could it get? How can we turn it around and have it not happen?
I express very little opinions in the book. I do express opinions, but what I thought was very important was to have objective measurements. So you see 18 different gauges that include a variety of measures of relative strength. Measures such as education, productivity, building of infrastructure, how many inventions come out of the country, many different measures of performance. So those objective performance measures are the most important thing I could get across. So anybody can watch those. They're like a health index. You can see if the levels are going improving or deteriorating, whether the income and balance sheet thing is improving, any of those. So it was most important to me not to be ideological or opinionated. I don't think my opinions matter as much as the reasoning behind that. And that's why I put those in, and also created a model that has a cause-effect relationship. I looked at 10-year leading indicators of output. In other words, everything that happens has causes that make it happen. And by being able to measure those cause-effect relationships and putting them into graphic and numerical form, and then using those to then give an indicator, I could show what happened, and that's what my objective was. So the reader of the book will be able to make their own judgments. What you see in the book are really those measures over time, repeatedly through the rises and declines of empires.
We are almost out of time, Ray, but I got to ask you before we let you go about crypto. You told CoinDesk you own some, even though you said you thought it was going to get killed by regulation. How much Bitcoin do you own? Do you have any other cryptocurrencies? And what do you think the outlook is for them now?
Well, I'm not going to give the precise amount of Bitcoin, but I do own some Ethereum as well. But the answer to your question is that I don't own a lot of it. I view it as an alternative money in an environment where the value of cash, money, is depreciating in real terms. And I think it's very impressive that for last 10, 11 years, that programming has still held up. It hasn't been hacked and so on, and it has an adoption rate. So I'm very big on diversification, and it's a relatively small part of the portfolio. I would like to say that cash, I've been quoted, cash is trash, that cash, which most investors think is the safest investment, is, I think, the worst investment, and that it's important because it loses buying power. The one thing I would say to investors is don't judge anything in your returns or your assets in nominal terms, in terms of how many dollars you have. View it in terms of inflation-adjusted dollars. And so cash, like this year, you'll lose 4 or 5% to inflation. And so pay attention to those, because I believe that that'll be the worst investment. And then beyond that, the important thing is to diversify one's portfolio well, because we know from that the surprises in the balance. We also know that those asset classes on average significantly outperform and will significantly outperform cash, and that they move between each other in a way that that has to do with correlations, because of when things go down, when the economy goes down, then bonds will do better than stocks, and so on and so forth. So diversification of assets. I view crypto as a small piece of that, and the message is cash is going to be a problematic asset, and hold that other diversified portfolio of assets. Keep looking at it in real terms, not nominal terms. And that diversification should be also international diversification from countries, not just asset classes, in order to have a truly well-diversified portfolio.
All right, Ray Dalio, founder of Bridgewater Associates and author of the new book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order, Why Nations Succeed and Fail. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
You've been watching Influencers. I'm Andy Serwer. We'll see you next time.